What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another datasheet deep dive. This is the video series where we pull one datasheet from Warhammer 40k and gratuitously overanalyze it. And today we're going to be talking about Tyranid warriors. Now, Tyranid warriors are fairly unique in that they have two profiles associated with them, both a melee and ranged version. And today, not only are we going to be diving into both of these datasheets and their synergies within the Tyranid faction, but also asking ourselves, which one should you prioritize in your Tyranid lists, and which one is more effective. So with that, let's dive in and talk about these Tyranid Gribblies. Now, the top line profile of both Tyranid warrior varieties is identical. They are kind of squishy medium infantry. While they are 3 wound models on relatively large bases, Tyranid warriors are not the hardest thing to kill. When we think about these large heavy infantry units, we're mostly considering units like Gravis armor or Centurion armored space marines, which come in at a high toughness value and strong saving throws. Tyranid warriors do have that toughness value. They are coming in at an appreciable toughness of 5, but they only have a 4+ save, which means that they come in at a similar resilience to many lighter Space Marine units. On top of that, they are relatively slow with a medium movement of 6, a mediocre leadership of 7, which is significantly offset by the fact that they do have the synapse keywords. They are always going to be rolling 3 dice for their leadership checks, alongside a solid OC of 2. Now, while I do mention that they are relatively squishy, it is important to keep in mind that these guys are extremely efficient for that profile. At the time of recording, we're under the June 2024 Munitorum Field Manual, and depending on the variety of Tyranid warriors that you're taking, these come in at between 22 and 25 points per model, which is an incredible deal for this style of profile. You're paying similar to Space Marine points for a larger model at a higher toughness value with 3 wounds, and just trading off that slightly worse armor save. OC2 is solid as well, but the fact that Tyranid warriors are relatively low speed and model count means that they don't make the greatest utility units. They only come in at base units of 3 strong and can be upgraded to units of 6, but can't go any larger than that without attaching characters. We'll put a pin in that for later, however, because I do think that there are some utility and support roles for these units. Now, the 2 different styles of warriors are broken down depending on their armament, either melee or ranged bioweapons. Each unit has a unique set of weapon profiles as well as a special ability. The melee bioweapon warriors have an ability similar to Space Marine Blade Guard. They can choose either to reroll their hit rolls or saving throws of a 1 chosen at the start of the fight phase. While their save is not very good to begin with, so enemies with a solid AP value are going to be punching clean through it, and the reroll saving throws isn't always that awesome. If you are getting hit by a high volume, lower AP enemy, rerolling saving throws can make them sustain a little bit longer against those lighter enemy attacks. However, aggression imperative, giving them reroll 1s to hit on a unit that has a ridiculous volume of attacks is incredibly useful, and that is going to be the one that you're choosing most often with these guys. Now, what weapons are they rerolling with? They have their claws and talons, a twin-linked 6 attack AP2 1 damage profile. With the new synapse rules from the June balanced data slate, Tyranids actually get +1 strength when they are in synapse range, and warriors being synapse creatures are always inside that distance, so they are actually going to be strength 6, which is an important profile in this edition, making them much better against toughness 11 or lower heavy enemies, or even lighter enemies that are toughness 5 or lower. On top of that, that high volume with the reroll 1s to hit and twin linked makes these attacks incredibly consistent. You can essentially guarantee that somewhere around 50% of your attacks will convert almost regardless of the defensive profile that your opponent has. And this high volume style of attack synergizes excellently with the other effect in the Tyranid faction that they have to buff their offense. We're going to be talking at the end of this video about a combo to make these guys absolutely ludicrously strong. And in a faction that tends to struggle with their melee damage output, these melee bioweapon warriors are an excellent hammer for the anvil of the remainder of a Tyranid force. You can back them up with strong shooting and resilient monster profiles to force your opponent to come out and fight them, and then counterattack with melee bioweapon warriors that hit ludicrously hard. Now, on the flip side, the ranged bioweapon warriors are a little bit of an enigma. They trade that incredibly strong melee profile for a significantly less exciting one, although, to be fair, it is definitely not something that you can dismiss. They come in with 5 base attacks and strength 5 AP1, and while that's not an incredible profile, it is fairly reasonable for what is ostensibly a primarily ranged unit that is incredibly cheap per model. A unit of 3 of these guys for only 65 points comes out with 15 of these attacks, which makes them incredibly good at dealing with other light infantry. On top of that, they also have a, to be fair, pretty terrible ranged profile profile as well. They can choose between Death Spitters, Devourers, or Spine Fists. Their Spine Fists are only 2 attacks, which is not particularly exciting, but regardless of the one they choose, they have a 4+ ballistic skill and either 5 Devourer attacks at strength 4 AP 0 or 3 Death Spitter attacks at strength 5 AP 1. Now, to be honest, these profiles are not very good. They're almost so atrocious it doesn't really matter which one you choose. The difference between AP 1 and AP 0 is not huge in 10th edition, since most of the time you're going to be attacking enemies with AP reduction effects or in cover anyway. So if the extra strength and range of the Death Spitter is valuable to you over the additional volume of the Devourer, you can choose that way, but most of the time it doesn't matter so much. They also get access to a heavy weapon, either a Venom Cannon or a Barbed Strangler, and these are kind of the exciting part of the unit. The Venom Cannon is strength 9 AP 2 for 2 damage with D3 blast attacks at a long 36-inch range. The Barbed Strangler is similarly blast, but comes in at only strength 6 AP 1 for 1 damage, however a higher volume at D6 plus 1 shots. The Venom Cannon is the most exciting here because you're able to punch through enemy medium infantry fairly respectively, and this guy has a pretty reasonable shot at knocking a Space Marine or 2 down every time he fires them. Now, on top of that, the special ability that the ranged bioweapon warriors have gives them the ability to shoot and charge when they fall back, making them very good at skirmishing with, again, lighter enemy units. If you come in and get engaged by light infantry, you can swing back at those infantry with a bunch of attacks, fall back, shoot them, and then charge back in to clear them out. And a couple units of these guys in the late game where they're trying to clear out enemy utility, that is, scoring the last couple of points your opponent needs to score a secret mission or grab those last few primary objective points, these guys can be an absolute terror. Now, with all that being said, these guys don't fill any solid niche like the melee bioweapon warriors do. It's not like Tyranids are lacking for anti-infantry ranged options, and a large brick of these guys fully buffed up with a character attached comes in at almost 200 points and has a okay chance at killing almost a unit of 5 Space Marines, which isn't really what you want to be spending your points on in a faction that's already strapped for combat units. That said, taking only small units of 3 of these guys, like I mentioned before, comes in at a current point value of 65 points. That makes them compete not with the heavy monsters and other really impressive range profiles that Tyranids have access to, but instead lighter utility units, things like Termagants and Neurogaunts. And for a similar points value to those units, you get solidly better shooting, dramatically better melee attacks, and higher resilience with a higher toughness value and save, and a similar number of wounds. While warriors are more susceptible to multi-damage attacks, you're most often not being hit by those multi-damage attacks, at least in the early game. Well, I don't think they wholesale replace these units, since having a higher volume and support effects like reactive moves that Termagants are representing is usually similarly strong, especially if you're running them out to secure objectives. 1 or 2 of these guys sitting in the back line holding objectives or performing actions are very efficient, and basically win the fight against any enemy utility units you can think of that would be deep striking or reserving in to try to score their own secondaries. Before scripting out this video, I actually had almost entirely written off ranged bioweapon warriors, but considering them through the lens of competing with a unit like Termagants for exactly the same points value, they actually come out ahead in a lot of instances. The downsides being that their objective control value is not quite as high, and they're worse at screening, but much better at combat, and especially fighting enemy utility units of a similar points value, these guys will beat them 9 times out of 10. Now with that, before we talk about which of these units you should be prioritizing, let's talk about their attachment, the Winged Tyranid Prime. This guy can attach into both varieties of Tyranid warriors and has some good buffs for both. He gives you sustained hits 1 on all of your attacks. This affects both your shooting and your melee attacks, meaning that he's not only benefiting the high volume melee attack of the melee Tyranid warriors, but he's also affecting your heavy weapon Venom Cannon attacks, for example, in a ranged warrior squad. He also has a solid melee profile with 6 2 damage attacks, although at a low AP, and that's backed up by a fight on death, all for a relatively cheap points value. But the real benefit that this guy brings is his fast movement. The Tyranid Prime has double the movement of the remainder of his warrior unit, so while the rest of the infantry are going 6 inches, he can go up to 12. While he still has to maintain coherency while moving, this means that you can create formations that actually dramatically enhance the distance that your warriors can travel. By deploying the Tyranid Prime at the back of the warrior squad, you can, when trying to commit them into the fight, essentially leapfrog the remainder of the unit with his higher movement value, gaining yourself somewhere between 3 and 4 inches of additional distance. Even Even better, this threat is kind of hard to estimate on the tabletop, so when fully buffed up, you can actually catch a lot of opponents off guard with the speed. An absolute godsend for melee warriors that, while they hit really hard, will have trouble actually getting into melee with their low base movement value. Well, I don't know if I would take this guy in ranged bioweapon warrior squads, because you're probably prioritizing low, small, cheap units. This dude is essentially a must include for melee squads. He dramatically improves their damage output with that sustained hits, which is an excellent buff since they're already getting wound rerolls off of their twin-linked weapons, and he dramatically improves their speed. Not to mention the fact that he gives them the Vanguard Invader keyword, making the unit a Vanguard Invader unit, and then eligible for a lot of synergies, especially with the Vanguard Onslaught detachment. So before we move on to talking about those detachments, let's talk about which of these units is better and which should you choose for your army. Now, I think generally speaking, melee bioweapon warriors are the superior choice. They're better because they have a more defined niche. Tyranids, while they have a lot of melee monster profiles, do not have any good melee infantry, and warriors circumvent that. These guys have excellent profiles at a solid AP, decent speed when attached with the Tyranid Prime, and incredible synergy with other effects in the Tyranid faction. Well, as I mentioned before, I wouldn't prioritize taking ranged warriors. I think they are good as a utility unit. You can take them in small groups of 3, they can perform actions in your backline, and you can throw them away in order to score secondaries or kill enemy utility units without really worrying about their cost. They're extremely good at killing light infantry, and while that's not particularly unique in Tyranids, it's definitely nice to have it in a package that costs you less than 70 points. So with that, let's move on to detachments and talking about some detachment synergies for these units. Starting with Invasion Fleets, the detachment ability is kind of anti-synergistic with melee warriors, since they're already going to be getting sustained hits from their attached Tyranid Prime, and lethal hits isn't the biggest of deals for them because their weapons are already twin-linked. It's still fine to have. It is, however, great for ranged warriors, since it will improve the damage output of both their ranged and melee attacks. A 5+ Feel No Pain from Rapid Regeneration is solid on these units, since they're oftentimes bringing somewhere around 24 wounds for the full brick of melee warriors with the attached character, and Overrun lets them duck behind cover after killing enemy units in melee, which is a nice buff to have as well. Assimilation Swarm has some interesting synergies with large units like these. Regenerating 3 wound models from their detachment ability is actually really good value, and can even increase your threat range in some instances by regenerating models in front of where the unit was standing. Well, warriors aren't the biggest beneficiaries of this synergy because they are so easy to kill that most of the time they're going to commit in, kill one enemy unit, and then get vaporized on the swing back. It is nice to be able to circumvent a smattering of enemy shooting that might kill 1 or 2 warriors on the way in. They can also gain huge benefits from enhancements, especially for melee warriors, including fights first, additional regenerations to their unit, or strengthen attack buffs from parasitic biomorphology. And they can even source a wound buff from Broodguard Impulse, which is hugely impactful for the melee weapon warriors, as we'll talk about later on in the video. Synaptic Nexus also has some huge benefits for the melee units. They get enormous buffs from all of the imperatives and can unlock them not only from the chosen imperative at the start of the round, but also from spending in your command phase for imperative dominance. Both +1 to charge rolls and +1 to hit rolls are huge benefits for these guys, and for melee weapon warriors, this is the number 2 place I would consider including them after Vanguard Onslaught, as we'll talk about next. You can also reduce incoming AP values against them using Reinforced Hive Node, and falling back and operating normally from Override Instincts is also a nice buff to have, especially for the melee unit, which doesn't have it built in. That said, some of the synergies that are most notable, things like Irresistible Will to give you reroll once to hit and wound, are entirely useless on the melee weapon warriors, since they're already going to be getting reroll ones to hit from their own ability, and reroll wound rolls from Twin Linked anyway. Although I guess you could also allow them to reroll their saving throws, which is, I don't know, kind of okay, I guess. Now last and certainly not least, let's talk about Vanguard Onslaught. This is where melee bioweapon warriors go kind of absolutely insane, since they get that Vanguard Invader keyword, which is so important for the detachment from having a winged Tyranid Prime attached into the unit. Not only does this improve their threat range by granting them the ability to advance or fall back and still charge, dramatically improving their speed, especially alongside the movement 12 Tyranid Prime that you're already going to have attached. They can also source +1 to hit and wound from Surprise Assault, as well as a lot of defensive abilities, reactive moves, and lone operative style effects to prevent enemies from shooting at them from stratagems, as well as the ability to return into reserve and pop back off, which is fairly useful for a unit that could potentially get refused flanked from your opponent and just run away from. If they've already killed their enemy and haven't been killed on the crackback, that allows them to redeploy around the table and continuously threaten enemy objectives as the game goes on. Now, before we wrap up the video here, let's talk about getting the most out of this unit. Any hit buff kind of unlocks an incredibly powerful combination on the melee bioweapon warriors, and even though their strength is a little middling at strength 6, if you can source +1 to wound from them, once they get across the threshold of wounding on 5s or 4s, the twin linked ability starts to go absolutely crazy, since that's the bracket in which you're going to be getting the most value from that ability. Because the unit on a base level with their attached character mixes hit rerolls from their own ability with sustained hits, any hit bonus gives melee bioweapon warriors an average hit rate of over 100%. This is available in Vanguard Onslaught with Surprise Assault, which forces an enemy to take a battle shock check before you attack them, gives you +1 to hit against them, and +1 to wound if they have failed that battle shock check. This is also available elsewhere in the Tyranid faction just by using Neurolictors. Neurolictors can force battle shock checks in your command phase, and then give you +1 to wound against enemies that fail battle shock checks, which works not only on any forced battle shock checks throughout the turn, from things like Molochs or Screamer Killers, but also Shadow in the Warp. If you have both +1 to hit and wound on these melee warriors, choosing reroll hits and gaining sustained hits from their Tyranid Prime, these guys go absolutely nuts. Averaging more than 1 hit per attack gives each melee warrior essentially close to 7 average hits, and once they're wounding on 5s, the unit, including the attached Tyranid Prime, inflicts an average of 14 damage on a Land Raider equivalent. Now that is including the Tyranid Prime, so that's also including another 6 attacks with a similar profile, not twin linked, but 2 damage at AP1. So that's past the wound roll. That's after saves have already been rolled. That's against an opponent that's the equivalent of toughness 12 with a 2+ save. However, that pushes to 19 damage against a 3+ save target, and things get even crazier against lighter enemies. If they're lower than T12 and the majority of the brick starts wounding them on 4s, lower toughness enemy units start to suffer upwards of 20 damage, averaging 23 if they are wounding on that 4+ into a 3+ save enemy. While this does require some help and can certainly be counteracted by effects like Armor of Contempt, the hope is that the target will be battle shocked once the warriors go in to fight them, meaning that Armor of Contempt will not be an available option once the warriors hit. This is one of the reasons that Tyranids can be so swingy on their damage output. They rely very heavily on battle shock to occur, and if it does so, they can almost double their damage against the target. However, if it doesn't, they oftentimes will fail to kill it. However, if the combo is fully assembled, they are gaining that +1 to hit and +1 to wound, and the enemy can't use their own defensive stratagems. These guys with a little bit of help will kill basically anything in the game. They do need a lot of that help to kill super heavily armored targets. You certainly need to put a couple of ranged attacks and a couple damage previously in the turn into large Titans or Land Raider equivalents in order to reliably kill them, but overall, the combination is huge for a faction that otherwise struggles to kill such enemies. Tyranid melee profiles tend to be kind of mediocre, and melee bioweapon warriors are the one shining example in the faction that can circumvent that trope. So with that, let me know down in the comment section what you think about these units and whether you would take Tyranid warriors in your army. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.